So thank you everyone for coming to another drop-in event for the Free Speech Champions Project, which exists in order to engage and inspire young people, particularly students at university and in schools, with issues and subjects around freedom of speech. And this event is obviously titled More Than One Way to Burn a Book, Literary Censorship in the 21st Century. And this is, of course, a hot topic. One of the examples, for example, is in Edinburgh University, they have ceased teaching Harper to Kill a Mockingbird on the grounds that it perpetuates a white saviour narrative. We've had many discussions around, can you separate the artist from the art, issues around identity politics and free speech and how, as that pertains to literary censorship, the relationship between de jure versus de facto literary censorship. And so there seems to be many challenges to literary freedom and freedom more broadly within society. And with this in mind, this is the space where we try and unpick and unravel all of the different layers and nuances of those challenges in the present day. And so we are delighted to be joined by two incredibly distinguished speakers, the novelist and columnist Lionel Shriver and the writer and critic Tomiwa. And we hope in this event we can explore all of those issues that I very briefly touched upon. So if people haven't been to the other drop-ins, we usually have a kind of more traditional panel-like discussion where everybody gives a few minutes introduction, then we take questions from the audience, but we're slightly changing the format for this one. And we want this to be much more discussion and collaborative, where rather than having introductory speeches, we really just dive straight into the subject matter, but do it in a much more thematic way. And so I'm really excited for this format in particular. And before we get started, just a few more things to say. This project is run by donations, so please do consider making a donation, and it really helps us just continue to do the work that we're doing and engage much more young people in this important subject matter. So yeah, I'm gonna just go straight into it and start off with the first question. And I'm gonna ask this to you, Lionel. In your view, could you just summarize very briefly in your understanding what literary freedom actually is, and why is that important? Why is that something that we should care about?
I'm a big advocate of there being no rules. So I want people to feel free to both write and read whatever they want to. And if you don't like it, you don't have to read it. You don't have to buy it. But that doesn't mean that because you disapprove of it, you should be able to exercise veto power and make sure that no one else can read it either. I'm not of the opinion that words constitute violence. I like to go back to the old-fashioned meaning of the word violence, which means doing physical damage to a person or property. And words can hurt you. You know, I'm a big fan of that old nursery rhyme about, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. We don't believe that anymore. And, call me fusty, but I think that's a better principle on which to base free speech issues.
Tomiwa, what would you say if you had to summarize what you understand as literary freedom and why you think that's important?
I would describe literary freedom basically as the same as Lionel's description. So the freedom to write about whatever you want without any form of threat or any form of coercion. And I think one of the most distinct elements of the cultural climate is that censorship in terms of the literary realm isn't imposed as it was in the past. So in the past, censorship was basically something which was more top down. So you couldn't write certain things that would constitute obscenity. So things which were sexually explicit, or things which more generally offended religious sensibility or morality. Whereas censorship in the contemporary world is something much more characterized by self-censorship. So people internalizing the potential damage that could be incurred when they choose to write about certain subjects or choose to pursue certain ideas. I would say um, literary freedom, artistic freedom is trying to um, navigate that self-censorship. So I think what counts as literary freedom or artistic freedom is different from what counted in the past. What counts now is trying to navigate that. But on the other hand, that's also dependent on the particular cultural climate that you inhabit, which I'm sure we'll discuss at greater length.
Yeah, I guess it'd be good to start to unpick that, because you mentioned some of the historical, much more traditional structural challenges to freedom, and then you mentioned kind of self-censorship. So I guess perhaps we can start off with the structural challenges of literary freedom in the present day. Lionel, what do you understand as perhaps the more de jure or top-down challenges to literary freedom right now?
I think there's a big problem in publishing on an editorial and administrative level. That is, publishing these companies has become very fearful and risk averse. So there's certain subjects they don't want to touch. There's certain plots they're going to avoid, i.e., the white savior narrative, whatever that is. And I find that there's a lot of cowardice in publishing right now. So, I would, of course, urge writers to go ahead and dare to write controversial books. But at the same time, I can't guarantee them that they're going to get them published. And even if they're really good, or perhaps especially if they're very good, because they will be frightening to the publishing industry. Publishing is under the impression that there are now a bunch of rules they have to obey. That's why I started off referring to these rules. There are no rules. The only thing that makes these ostensible cultural rules have any force is that we obey them. And I'm afraid publishing is obeying them to the letter. So, for example, I'm pretty much not allowed to use accents in my work anymore, unless I have a feeling that if I had an accent that was of say a white American Southerner, I could get away with it, but not anyone from another ethnicity. So that's out. I had a lot of concern about the fact that there was one line in my most recent book that described someone's complexion as the color of walnut. I mean, because there's a new rule that you can't compare anyone's complexion to foodstuffs. I actually do find this stuff kind of comical. That's a fake rule, right? So I'm dealing with editors now who are petrified that they're going to, set off some kind of a landmine and get in trouble. And I actually think this is the source of a lot of so-called cancel culture. It's not so much the Twitterati who are, going into hysterics over this, that, and the other thing. It's paying attention to them is the problem. You know, I am all for free speech. So if you want to go nuts on Twitter and take my latest book apart, fine, that's your right. But what's not right is for my publisher to respond to it and say, oh, let's withdraw the book. And that's the kind of thing that's happening. And by the way, I should add that my publisher has never done that to me. I'm published by HarperCollins, and they have stuck by me. And that's one of the reasons I'm still standing. And that's what we need to see more of. It's not just writers daring to write what they want. It is people in positions of power who don't act as if they're in positions of power. And they don't back up the people to whom they owe ultimate loyalty. And in this case, that's, of course, their writers.
Lionel, just coming in on that, back in 2018, as I'm sure many attendees this evening will remember, you were pretty rampant in your criticism of Penguin Random House for their diversity policy. I think you wrote in The Spectator that a manuscript written by a gay transgender Caribbean who dropped out of school at 7 would perhaps be published regardless of its literary merit. So on that, I'm interested, obviously that was 3 years ago now. Have things got worse in your opinion? Is that still the case?
Oh, it's definitely worse. Now, look, this is a delicate subject. The last thing I want to do is seem as if I'm down on diversity because it's become a hallowed good. Clearly, publishing has responded to the whole George Floyd era by aggressively publishing a lot of people from different backgrounds. And for the most part, that's all to the good, as long as these are books of merit. And that's where I draw the line, and that's where apparently I part ways with the current culture. Because I still want us to choose to publish books because either they're really good or they're really saleable. Now, you know, let's not be naive. There are lots of books that are published that are complete rubbish, but there's a reason that we think that they're going to sell anyway. So fine. That's publishing as a business. I want publishing to continue to function as a business and to make intelligent commercial decisions. I also want for that tiny little slice of publishing that constitutes literary work to choose work that passes a certain excellence test and not just a skin color test. You would think that that would be self-evident. You know, fair enough, that quote from my column, I guess I'm supposed to feel all regretful about it. Well, I don't. You know, it was droll. And it was just a little composite character. None of the elements of that composite character were expressed in a way that was remotely insulting to any group of people, okay? But it was just sending up publishing for, you know, this is the kind of writer that they simply couldn't resist, even if the work in question was atrocious. So I don't want us to give up on meritocracy in publishing. I think we can have, there's no reason to choose between diversity and excellence. And in fact, if you imagine that we have to choose between diversity and excellence, then I'd call you a racist. It's really fun to wield that word myself, because there are plenty of people from different backgrounds who write very well and submit wonderful books. So, you know, we can have both.
Thanks for that. Sorry, thank you for that, Lionel, covering the publishing industry. I wanted to kind of move this to Tomiwa because you're a recent university graduate. And I sort of wanted to ask whether this kind of trend has been reflected in how English literature is taught at a higher education level.
Yeah, and I think you saw this accelerated after the murder of George Floyd last year. So in my alma mater, UCL, there was basically an open letter which was written by many of the graduate students. This was after I left, a year after I left. There was an open letter written by many of the graduate students, which accused the English faculty of being complicit in systematic racism because it refused to decolonize the curriculum, which is another way of saying that the authors on the curriculum list was insufficiently diverse, insufficiently racially diverse. And I think this is not just confined to UCL. I think it's a widespread problem. And I think key to understanding the problem is because many of the people that espouse this kind of social justice rhetoric proclaim their support for diversity. But the issue is that this is only a very superficial and thin form of diversity. They don't espouse pluralism, diversity in terms of ideological or intellectual viewpoints. And also their form of diversity as well. It doesn't actually, it's very American centric. That's what I'm trying to say. It's very focused on the sort of the racial politics of America, which doesn't necessarily reflect the experiences of the particular ethnic group that are most likely to actually go to the university or study in the university. So it's a very sort of constrained version of identity, and it also relies on a particularly condescending and patronizing perspective on Black and ethnic minority people. When they say that we should decolonize the curriculum and focus on Black experiences, what in many cases what they mean is focus on the oppression of Black people and ethnic minority people. So Black and ethnic minority people are defined exclusively through negative experiences of racism and structural prejudice, rather than acknowledging the fact that that there is more to being a Black or an ethnic minority person than being the victim of racism. So it's a combination of different things, and I think one other key aspect of it is the sort of acquiescence from many of the professors, academics, and administrators to this type of social justice rhetoric, and I think that's a mixture of guilt, maybe sort of cynicism as well, perhaps cowardice, and it's also a sort of condescension as well, because they assume that this is what Black and ethnic minority students want themselves. So why don't we just give it to them? University is meant to be a market, so we should satisfy the interests of the student population. But this is not actually the case. There is no such thing as a Black or ethnic minority voice on these issues, just as precisely because Black and ethnic minority people are not homogenous. So yeah, it's a combination of all these different factors which has made it made university spaces increasingly inhospitable to freedom of speech and intellectual diversity.
Yeah, I wanted to just pick up on something. I guess this idea that before that the publishing world was a meritocracy, because isn't the assumption in the fact that they are doing this diversity drive and hiring lots of new ethnic minority writers based off of the assumption that they were previously excluding them, or these people were only getting them based off of the fact that they are ethnic minorities. Isn't there then a suggestion that, you know, that they were actually overlooking voices that previously they may not have considered as valuable, as interesting, and actually there is now more demand for hearing new types of perspectives and different types of stories? So was there really ever this time where publishing was this meritocracy, and actually we're just seeing an expansion of a new interest in different types of experiences and stories? Lionel?
I'd have to say that this thirst for a wider palette of authors, if you will, goes back many years, okay? It's not just in the last year. So the door has been open to minority writers for quite some time. And there are whole programs at, for example, at HarperCollins has one, which are essentially trying to cultivate writers from a variety of backgrounds, aggressively trying to shepherd them into the position where they will have the first book and be published by HarperCollins. And by the way, I'm fine with that. You know, I think these are useful. And I think that participation for the people who are involved is exciting and makes these writers feel that maybe they have a future. And you know, I'm all for that kind of cultivation of new talent. Where I draw the line is I do not like quotas, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, you know, this deluge of especially Black writers in the lists of publishing in the last year, the post-Floyd era, is a little embarrassing, okay? It's so bending over backwards. It's clearly a kind of act of placation. It's like, leave us alone, we're good people. Look at all of the diverse authors we've got. It's a bit much. It's not going to do any big harm, so that's okay. And some of these books are probably pretty damn good. So, and we can say, okay, there's a little overcompensation going on. I hope the kind of hysterical overcompensation eventually dies down, and we just consider it fairly normal to have a range of skin colors in any given list, and also not feel that it has to meet some kind of arithmetical, you know, perfectly mirroring the demography of the population at any given time. I mean, that is what Penguin Random House was promising to do in 2018, and that's why I made fun of them. In some ways, dealing with it comically was a mistake because it's not funny.
Yes, I think it could be good for us now to probably unpick some of these cultural challenges, because we've so far talked about institutions capitulating to external pressure or these kind of rules within society. So in your understanding, Tomiwa, what are those cultural challenges, and where are they really coming from? What exactly are they capitulating to?
Cultural challenges on issues around identity. That's the key. That's the key. That's the crux of the issue. Many publications now have something called sensitivity readers, and sensitivity readers. They've been a thing in America for at least the past 5 years, maybe longer than that. And they've been recently creeping into UK publications as well. And sensitivity readers are essentially freelance copy editors that publishers pay to make sure that the writers of certain books, when they're writing about the experiences of ethnic minority, to make sure that these experiences seem accurate and seem authentic. So they're basically a way for publishers to cancel-proof their new books, essentially, to make sure that the new books are less likely to be cancelled. And I think this new phenomenon speaks to, again, that the atmosphere of fear that circulates amongst many cultural institutions, especially, and I think this is the interesting thing, especially cultural institutions that are predominantly liberal left. So it's a case of the institutions that are already liberal left that are most vulnerable to this particular type of social justice rhetoric, rather than, say, institutions which are populated by people with right-leaning views. So it's publishing, it's the humanities and academia, and it's also in teaching as well. So predominantly liberal left institutions, which are most vulnerable to this particular type of ideological pressure. And I think it's coming from a subset of largely younger people that are very digitally savvy, and younger people that have also completely internalized this particular social justice rhetoric and worldview, which with its own particular argot and its own particular phrases, which is probably alienating to people that are not already familiar with it. And these group of young people, actually, it's an interesting issue, because I think there is a hard core of young people that espouse this particular rhetoric, but there is also like a wider diffusion of people that don't necessarily espouse this rhetoric, but they just tacitly endorse it and go along with it. It's a case of there's a particular term for it. It's called preference falsification. So it's when you say you believe something just because you think it's the socially approved viewpoint. So that there's a core of young people that espouse this type of social justice rhetoric, but I think there's a wider diffusion of younger people that sort of tacitly endorse and agree with it. And I think these young people, as they get older and as they enter into many liberal left cultural institutions, are putting immense ideological pressure on the administrators and the leaders within these institutions to acquiesce to this particular worldview.
I just wanted to pick up on something you said about the liberal left. How has this kind of shift happened? Because it seems that the shift of censorship has very much moved from the right to the left. You know, we used to have issues around, like Lady Chatterley's lover, I believe, being censored because it was seen as too obscene and too sexually explicit, going against people's religious and moral sensibilities. And now it seems to have very much moved the other way. How has that shift kind of occurred, both within academia and within the cultural landscape?
I don't know how much I'm going to be able to illuminate you on this point, because I'm scratching my head about it all the time. I'm not quite sure how this did happen. Your observation is spot on, that when I was young, the people who were trying to control you were on the right. So they didn't want you to have sex before you got married, and they wanted you to go to church, and you couldn't use bad language, and you couldn't, have explicit sex in movies, or, and my generation rebelled against all this, and now we help bring in a whole new kind of oppression, which is like, how did the free love generation, turn into the cancel culture generation, or at least the generation that is not standing up to it in a lot of instances. People my age these are the administrators of the whole administrative class are generally baby boomers, right? So how did we get here? I am mystified. Now I'm familiar with the fact that this whole critical race theory stuff started coming in to academia in the early 1990s, and it's been percolating away and festering, and now it seems to be graduating into the corporate world and in general the world of work. But I really think that our directional terminology is no longer useful. The left has become a force of coercion and social control. The left no longer believes in freedom. The word liberal is no longer appropriate, which is the same root as liberty. And I've just watched a general transformation on the left. It's not just policy, it's philosophy. And in the olden days, the left, liberals, imagined that people were fundamentally good and just needed to be allowed to be good. Given a choice, they will choose virtue. And conservatives conventionally said, nah, people are basically, rotten. And if you're going to control them, you at least have to entice them with self-interest. And whereas the left thought that that you can entice people with virtue, all right? This whole paradigm has gone to hell. And now the left conceives of people as fundamentally bad, right? First off, they're all racists. But on top of that, they have to be controlled. I mean, that's been on display in COVID. It's been the left that has been big on coercive government measures to control people, because people cannot be trusted to act in their own self-interest or in the interest of their community. They have to be forced. And this is the new left-wing philosophy. It is the way the left now looks at human beings, as fundamentally fallen, as born into original sin. And, life is about, being re-educated and being controlled. You have to be controlled to be good. And the right by default inherits a better belief in the human race, and certainly a belief in freedom, most importantly, freedom of speech. And it's very awkward for someone like me, because I end up getting stuck with strange bedfellows. I just got invited on Tucker Carlson on Fox News. I don't know what to do, right? I'm not sure I want to brand myself that way. For Britain, that may not mean so much to you, but it means a lot over here. I'm in Brooklyn, by the way. So, I'm paralyzed. I happen to agree with him on the subject he wants me to talk about, but what do? Then I suddenly brand myself, I'm Fox News. This is the point, that suddenly my ideological colleagues they're kind of half and half. Some of them are classical liberals who've been abandoned by the hard left, and are often the greatest victims of the hard left, because those are the people that the hard left really hate, is libertarians and classical liberals. They don't even care about the right wing. But then again, the other half of my colleagues are like, who are you? And how did I end up over here? Why are we friends? It's, so, I mean, maybe it's not entirely a bad thing in terms of shaking up our categories. I think the whole concept of right and left has gone to hell and is no longer a useful way of thinking of people politically. So there's at least that to get out of it. But what is not good is to watch the left that I grow up with having corrupted into a force of authoritarianism.
Do you mind, can I just pick up on something? This is perhaps more of an abstract question in terms of, in literary terms. But one of the things that fiction and literature seems to me to have always been is this idea of both writers and readers going on this journey, and they can travel into other perspectives. Anyone can write about anything and anyone can read about anything. And yet what we're seeing, as you've mentioned a lot, is this whole concern with cultural appropriation. So a white writer can't write black characters, or a straight writer can't write gay characters, and what have you. So I don't know if we could perhaps zoom out a little bit and go back to perhaps first principles, but what, in your views, as writers, critics, novelists, is fiction good for anyway? What is the point of it? And what does this tell us about the current moment that we've seemed to have lost some of that spirit?
Well, I'll just pick that up. I think one of the things we've lost is fundamentally what we think literature's for. And there's this fashionable view that literature is supposed to be a force of good in the world. And no, it isn't. There is no obligation to write books that make people, better human beings, or that improve the world in the slightest. One of the fun things about writing fiction, especially, is that it can be written for any purpose you want. Not only is the story up to you, the characters are up to you, but the whole point of the thing is up to you. Only you know why you're writing it. And there is no specific agenda that someone outside you delivers you and you have to meet. So, no, you don't have to promote equity and inclusion or any of that stuff. You can write for whatever purpose you want, including just to make people laugh, just to entertain people. That's a noble purpose in my view. So this whole idea that literature has to have moral purpose, has to be somehow improving, I find nauseating. I don't know about you. I mean, some of you before this event started admitted that you can't stand reading fiction. Fair enough. But those of you who do, I mean, honestly, do you go pick up a novel because it's like, I want to become better today. I want to be morally improved. I want this author to instruct me on how to be a finer human being. No, that's not why I pick up a novel. I want to be diverted. I want to be brought into another world. I want to be surprised. So the last thing I want to know is, oh, this is going to be another one of those books that tells me that it's important not to be racist. Oh, great. That's exactly what I want to reach for when I'm trying to fall asleep. So, I think we have to widen the lens back out. And by the way, this is for all of art, and for that matter, all of life. That I just think our whole culture has become narrowly focused on morality, and furthermore has narrowed the very idea of morality into even more a tinier space. So it's like we don't care anymore about anything unless it has to do with race and gender. And that's a very small area of morality, which is a bigger deal. It covers many, many different instances. As you go through your day, you're making various moral choices. They don't all have to do with race and gender. It's whether you pick up the phone and talk to your mother or not. I'm waiting for this era to be over. I'm trying to push a little harder. It's got a life of its own. And I don't know what else to do but to stand out on the side and it's like, hello, there's a bigger world out here and it's much more fun than you're having.
I've got a question for Lionel, just on what she just said. So in general, I agree with you about fiction shouldn't be moralistic, but I think it's slightly more complicated because many of the cultural issues is to do with fiction that's work that's being taught in schools. So fiction being taught to children and school children, and many of the cultural issues about sensitivity readers concern young adult fiction as well, which often, I would say, usually has some sort of moralistic bent. So would you apply that's the attitude you've just outlined about fiction in general to fiction being taught to school children or young adult people?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think this whole thing of the curriculum is massively important, and the way that we're starting to pick certain classics out because of violating one of these fake rules. You know, the fact that Harper Lee is being eliminated. I'm not quite sure whether that's funny or just tragic, but I think we have to stick up for these books, and we can't let narrow-minded and very frightened people and conformist people who are trying to, you know, follow the zeitgeist as they understand it, to dominate decisions about what children are taught and what university students are taught. And I think at this point, a little pressure from students themselves would be useful. You know, demands that no, we do not want to be rescued. We don't need to be protected from, you know, evil texts that have our, you know, that white savior narrative. You know, we can take it. So don't condescend to us. You know, don't try to protect us. We are not snowflakes, and we demand to read the greatest literature ever written, whoever wrote it. So I'm afraid at the present moment, there's a subsection of students that is enjoying the exercise of their power, and like the fearfulness they've created, and so are more out to, you know, find yet another book that used to be considered a classic and above reproach, and suddenly decide there's something wrong with it and get it eliminated. I think that it is, however briefly, satisfying, and also gives people an appetite for simply being further censorious. But that does a grave injustice to the larger student body. I think for the most part, this is a small number of people proportionately, and they're calling the shots because these are the people that the administration and faculty are afraid of. But it's not fair to everyone else. And I think there is a lot of just keeping your head down. Because, you know, when I talk to students at universities, on occasion, I do, a lot of them seem quite reasonable and even a little annoyed, you know, because they're being characterized as shrill and extremist and censorious, and it's not fair. Everyone is not like that.
To what extent is this like a specific cultural moment though? Because I think if we look back at the history of literary criticism, we definitely thought that the original critics like Joseph Addison and Samuel Johnson thought that literature was meant for moralistic purposes. It was meant to spread the message of empire. That is what they said, and that's the history of it. So to what extent do you think this is just a cultural moment that we're living through? that will pass?
I've been talking.
Yeah,
to,
yeah, sure.
You wanna?
Yeah, a cultural moment that will pass. Yeah, yeah. It's not just from the 18th century that you find literary critics emphasizing the moralistic element of literature. You also add it to some extent with the Cambridge professor F.R. Leavis in the 1950s that had the notion of the great books, the great canon that any sort of civilized person ought to read, and that notion of literature being something which is civilizing as well, sort of presupposes a moralistic outlook. But I think the difference between earlier forms of literary critics that stressed the moralistic significance of fiction to contemporary social justice activists is that social justice activists place a great emphasis on identity and individual identity, and I think it's worth also considering the fact that because many people would say that this is simply a sort of conservative reactionary turn, but I do have some sympathy to some of the sort of underlying conditions that many young people face today. Compared to earlier generations, many young people today at the moment face the possibility of not owning their own home or being able to establish a family, or delaying these things. And this is for a host of complex economic and cultural factors. So I think this sort of emphasis on individual identity and authenticity is a sort of a way to compensate for the lack of stability in their own particular identity, if that makes sense. So I think the sort of environment that's conducive to freedom of expression and to a free exchange of ideas is one that's fundamentally predicated on tolerance. But you can only be tolerant to other people, I think, if you have a great sense of your own identity, a more stable and secure sense of your own identity. If your sense of identity is sort of fragmented and insecure, I think that makes you less likely to be tolerant to other people's opposing viewpoints. And I think that there are a lot of cultural and economic factors that explains why for many young people, they don't have a sure sense of their own identity.
Tomiwa, just whilst we're on the cultural, looking at the cultural obstacles that literary freedom, I was wondering what role you think our culture of social media has to play in current threats to literary freedom. It seems like every couple of months the hashtag RIP JK Rowling is trending, and obviously 15 years ago that wouldn't have been the case. So yeah, to what degree does social media foster this bottom up notion of censorship?
I'm not much of an expert on social media because I stay off it, and I plan on staying off it. It's one of the best decisions I ever made. So I will do my little advertisement for this route. It means you have a lot more time. And as a writer, it means that you're going to be a lot less aware of your audience. And I can't tell you how important that is. That sounds counterintuitive. Writers are often urged to consider their audience, for whom are you writing this and everything. And at another time in my career, I might have not said this, but at this point, the less you know about your audience, the better. Especially because social media seems to attract the worst sort, honestly. People are much more vociferous about their ugly opinions than their nice ones. So the threat, if you're overexposed to your audience, is to get so depressed and so disheartened by the fact that no matter what you write, you're not understood, which is antithetical to the very act of writing, that you quit, that you give up, because these people are not worth it. The whole exercise of trying to communicate doesn't function. And these people are just too disheartening. They don't represent the real audience. And they, if you write books, for example, I can testify, people come to my events, they're not these Twitter people, they're other people that you just never hear from. They're sane, they're polite, they're appreciative. Occasionally they have a criticism and they venture it with deftness and consideration, So being on social media is a very destructive thing to do as a writer. Now, I have to say that to use a fashionable word, I am privileged because I can afford to stay off social media and still get the word out that I've published a new book. And I am sympathetic with younger people who need to get their name around and, feel that having some presence on social media is a necessity. But I'd still keep it to a minimum and make it, professionally productive rather than getting sucked into it. It's also a form in which, honestly, it's easy to get your feelings hurt, and that's not, that doesn't make your day any better. It doesn't make your work any better. So I know that social media is driving a lot of this. It seems to me that it's a driver of velocity. This rapidity with which various social manias have swept us in the last 10 years. The sudden obsession with transgenderism, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter thing that went all over the world in days. The fact that this stuff sweeps everyone in such a short period of time has to have a technological explanation, because we've always had fads, we've always had ideologies or social obsessions that have washed over us, but they used to be more localized, and it used to take a lot less time to spread. So as far as I'm concerned, social media definitely is in the mix for explaining this whole larger obsession with cancel culture. Now, I did also want to say something about Phoebe's earlier question about whether or not, we're just in a brief thing and we'll come out of it. And, well, it's true that everything passes in time. I guess what the constant here is that we're always dealing with forces of control versus forces that are trying to get away from control, constraint and liberty. It's an ongoing battle in human society because, we're always afraid of anarchy, crime, whatever, bigotry, but we don't want to go so far that, we end up like China. And we also always have forces of orthodoxy versus forces of heresy. That any given era has dominant ideologies, dominant conceits, things that everyone thinks. And some of them turn out to be really stupid. So, and then we look back on them and say, you know, oh, phrenology was ridiculous. But there was a time when people really thought that the lumps on people's head were meaningful and told you all about them and how smart they were. So I'm sure we've got our own version of phrenology. But there's always going to be something, right? There's always going to be a dominant ideology or a set of ideas that everyone is supposed to accept. And there's going to be inevitably a minority of people who question those ideas, who stand outside and say, you know, can we think again? Or I disagree with that. And they're going to be very unpopular, if not, you know, whatever the version of that era's version of burning at the stake is. And that's what we're dealing with now. So eventually, whatever the dominant ideology is, will change. But the fact that there is one is not going to change.
Yeah, eugenics was very popular amongst progressive intellectuals until the Second World War.
I had a question, I think for Tomiwa. Are we to some extent downplaying the role that literature does have in reproducing harmful cultural depictions that can have real world consequences on marginalized groups? I mean, it is only in living memory that we had the minstrel shows and many depictions of Black people in America in particular, but in other groups within society. And that did shape how they were perceived in that society. So is there no truth in those that advocate the whole idea of cultural appropriation, that there can be ways of representing certain groups that can shape the way that we think about them and consequently the way that we treat them?
Yeah, but I think you can say that, I think there's a difference between saying this particular writer or this particular author should represent ethnic minority people in a particular way, and saying that this particular writer or author should not be allowed to write about ethnic minority people in this particular way. So I think there's an important distinction between disagreeing with the way in which a particular writer or author or artist depicts Black and ethnic minority people, and saying that they should not be allowed to do so on the basis of the offense, which might be grievous. It might be a grievous offense that they have caused. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've always criticized writers for using stereotypes. I mean, that's just bad writing. That's literarily lazy. And that's usually what it is laziness more than prejudice. It's just, you know, not forcing yourself to think beyond certain broad, commonplace strokes. So, you know, that's been an issue in fiction forever. And, you know, I don't like stereotypes of any sort. They're bad characters. They're not interesting. But you're correct, I think, to make the distinction between that issue and the matter of actual permission. So it's not just that you can only write certain kinds of ethnic characters and not others, but it's whether someone like me can write ethnic characters at all. And that's basically what I'm sometimes told, is that I'm not allowed to use anything but white characters. I mean, when you put it that way, it's just dubious on the face of it. You know, oh, we have to have fictional apartheid. And therefore I have to represent the world as it does not look. We have to go back to the 1950s, and you know, so if I set something in the United States, all the people are white, because that way I don't steal something from someone else. And I think the mistake we make is start with the word appropriation in that tiresome term. When I make a character up, I'm not appropriating anything from anyone, okay? It's my character, and it's made up, right? So it's creating something from nothing. It's not taking from anyone else. And that character belongs to me. Whatever skin color that character has, even if that character is blue, it belongs to me, okay? So there is no stealing. You can criticize books for being in some ways inauthentic. Fine. We've done that forever also, you know, bad writers not doing their homework, not understanding what a certain place looks like, or how people speak. They, you know, so that's called literary criticism. But I don't expect to make some kind of application to whatever party I'm supposed to apply to get permission to write a character, when I think there is a real question of who possesses an imaginary character. So if I make up a Black character, I do not create a representative of someone else that therefore suddenly belongs to this whole enormous group of people and not to me. That's just a misunderstanding of who owns these little imaginary creatures that, you know, let's face it, they don't exist. So how could they possibly belong to anyone but me, because they came from my head? You know, so I just think this whole notion of cultural appropriation is profoundly wrong-headed. And that's definitely one of the concepts that I am waiting to go away. And I do think that it's one of the concepts that this era will be remembered for, and it will be eventually, I expect it to be mocked.
Could I just jump in? I think we might be going out to the audience in a second. I can see some hands raised who obviously want to have part in the discussion, but I think very pertinent to what's just been discussed is this quote from another writer who's also been criticised quite harshly for using characters not of his own ethnicity, from Martin Amos's Inside Story. He says, "In literature, there is no room for territoriality. So politely ignore all warnings about cultural appropriation and the like. Go where your pen takes you. Fiction is freedom, and freedom is indivisible." So I just wanted to put that in case you had any notes on that quote. But I think that's a good way to summarize what I just said.
Thanks for finding that.
I'd just like to quickly jump in and say, is there not a very weird dichotomy as the universes you're creating? J.K. Rowling's often criticized for not having enough minority ethnic characters, which if you actually read the books isn't true. But is there not a weird dichotomy? Somehow you're meant to make your worlds representative, but then if you write characters, then you're criticized for not writing them authentically. So how do you even begin to navigate that kind of landscape where whatever you do is wrong?
Just stop writing.
Yes. Yeah, and by the way, I think that's the intention. I mean, the impulse is to shut you down, not. And you're quite right. It's catch-22. You cannot win. You know, if I were to do as I'm told and not write ethnic characters and only use white people, then I'd be criticized because I wasn't reflecting the world around me and my cast wasn't diverse enough. And, you know, it's just, you cannot win. You cannot win. So the key is don't play the game. You know, you don't play games, you can't win.
Okay, so we've got 20 minutes left, so we'll open it up to the floor. Please feel free to ask a wide range of questions, but definitely would like to prioritize questions that explore what impact this has on society and the individual, particularly questions around self-censorship, but feel free to ask what you'd like. So I'm going to go to Nilu first. Oh, we can't hear you, Nilu.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Louder? Yeah.
Okay. This question's for Tomiwa, but I'd be happy to have Lionel's input as well. You know, there's this call for decolonizing the curriculum, especially in literature. And I find it interesting as an immigrant that there's no incentive for these people who demand variety to learn a new language. There's no shortage of writers of color. They just happen to often write in their own mother languages. And I think that it's kind of an interesting point because there's no accountability on the reader to become more versatile in their understanding and their language skills. So what do you guys think about that?
Well, as in readers should be encouraged to read books in foreign languages as a way of decolonizing the curriculum. Is that the question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I do think that that there is a problem with the education system in this country when it comes to learning foreign languages, which I think ironically is a consequence of like the supremacy and the prestige of English itself. And in terms of, I think related to the issue that's just been sort of brought up by that question, when it comes to broadening our cultural palette, is that when it comes to the term decolonize your curriculum, as I think I alluded to earlier in this discussion, it's very superficial, and it's very it doesn't actually capture the cultural diversity of ethnic minority people, which I think is related again to the problems with using terms like BAME or Black people without specifying which cultural or social group in particular that you're referring to, and presuming that these terms sort of that these terms by themselves is sort of an accurate reflection of Black and ethnic minority people, whereas in fact there are so many cultural groups which are captured by this term, and which is not necessarily reflected in the sort of decolonize your own curriculum discourse. And I think this goes back again to the way in which our discussions around diversity and the relationship between diversity and culture is very much mediated through an American lens and through an American perspective. It's every sort of every Anglophone society, it seems, is basically fighting out America's racial politics, or adopting America's racial politics to their own particular ethnic and cultural makeup, and I think that's one of the most significant cultural issues of our time. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer to your question, but there it goes.
Okay. We'll take a couple questions at a time, just because we've only got 15 minutes. So Zara, then Izzy.
Sure. Thank you so much to both speakers. My question is for Lionel. I totally agree with you, Lionel. I think that what you said about your characters being your own figment of your own imagination, and you haven't stolen from anybody physically, it's all yours. But I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because I don't think the argument around cultural appropriation is necessarily about stealing. I think it's more about it's not fair. So the argument to me is more like, so you have a white writer who thinks of a character, I don't know, with dreadlocks. And then you have a Black writer that has the same or a similar character, let's say both books or stories have a similar amount of success, but let's say that the white writer has just a tiny bit more success than the black writer. The argument around cultural appropriation then becomes, well, this writer accumulated this amount of success, had this much money only because they were white, and they had to use black cultural ideas or capital to make their story successful, and that's why they have this success. So what do you have to say to that? Because I don't think it's necessarily stealing. I think it's the argument around that is more or less about it's not fair.
Okay, but this still comes down to ownership, okay? Because you're saying that if the white writer is more successful, that that success is based on something that doesn't belong to him or her, right? That's what the stealing is. It's still an accusation of stealing. Whereas I would say that the two books you just described, each of those black characters belongs to each of those writers who created them, full stop. So, and then publishing is a free-for-all. No one ever quite understands why one book succeeds and another fails. Publishing itself has no idea, by the way. It's one of the horrible things you find out if you ever put a book out. So it's just, you throw your bread upon the waters and see what comes back. And the chances are that, there's something about that, the one book rather than the other, that captures the public imagination and the other one doesn't. It's not necessarily to do with race. And I don't think that, the white author should therefore, somehow pay reparations for having borrowed this character like a cup of sugar from the neighbors. It's not borrowed. You make the character up. It didn't exist before. And that character can have whatever characteristics, whatever appearance, whatever history that you want. And so it's not, publishing is unfair. Okay, I'll grant you that. And the best books don't always succeed. A lot of crap sells a lot of copies. So, if you're looking for fairness, go into something else. And the writers who really deserve it, maybe worked on their book for 10 years, and then finally comes out and doesn't even get reviewed. It's not fair. It's not a fair world. So, but I still come back to that issue of ownership. And, when you make up a character of any sort, you're not taking anything from the world. You're not taking anything from other people. And the fate of those characters and the fate of the book itself, it's partially up to you and fate, accident, and a little bit of justice thrown in.
Okay, we'll take 3 questions at a time because we've got quite a few to get through before we'll go back to the speakers. Izzy, then Dylan, then Alistair, please.
This is a question for Lionel. You mentioned right in the beginning how you're not allowed to use accents anymore. And I've never thought about this because, as we've discussed earlier, I don't read fiction. But it actually made me think because when you're writing a character who has a non-standard accent and you're writing it with non-standard spelling, aren't you implying that the rest of the book is written with a normal accent? And aren't you also implying that the kind of non-standard accent, the minority accent, kind of isn't spelt? And if it were to be spelt, it would be spelt funny. So I started seeing the problem with that.
It's true that I observe the rules of standard English, and That's why it's called an accent, or it's a transliterated accent when it breaks the rules of standard English, right? And this is now disapproved of because it's called othering. Now, let me tell you how much I hate that word. Othering, other is not a verb. Sorry. I think this is one of those issues where, yeah, okay, fine. I guess what you're saying is that what the reader is to infer is that this person is speaking incorrectly. No, I don't believe that the inference is that it's incorrect, but it is distinctive. And you just want your reader to be able to hear the inflection, the sound of the way people speak. And I'd be the first to say, if you are going to use any transliteration of accent, try to use a light touch, and not again because it's othering, but because it's hard to read, and if you overdo it, it's annoying, it's heavy-handed. And so that when I have used accents, I've tried to be very gentle, just to imply, give the reader just enough signs that they can hear the music of the speech in their heads. And it's now a dangerous thing to do, especially if you're a white writer and you're recording any kind of accent with minorities. And it's artistically profitable if it discourages people from overdoing it, as I said, because I hate reading heavily accented dialogue on the page. It just slows me way down. But I personally don't mind the odd little touch to give me the music, to give me just a few signals. It's just about the way, I love the different ways people talk, so it's not meant to be critical. I just find it fabulous, the different ways that people use even just English, the different ways we speak, the different music that groups of people impart to the language, I think is fabulous and a great pleasure. And I think it's unfortunate that we're in an era that we're so touchy that we can't just take pleasure in it.
Dylan?
Hi. You guys have both said a lot of amazing things today, but there was one thing that Tomiwa said that I wanted to touch on, and it was that a group of people can't be authentically tolerant. I'm paraphrasing here. Can't be authentically tolerant unless they know what they themselves are. And that made me think, what is the attempt here to establish this kind of new morality in the publishing industry? Like, is that based in something like a desire to establish like a collective identity, or is it simply just bored people with existential malaise trying to take control?
Yeah, that's a very it's a very complicated question. I think it's a mixture of different things. So with a lot of these cultural battles, it's not just one thing, and I think the same person might also have mixed motives when it comes to this issue. So I do think that there is definitely a strain of a sort of new morality to replace all the older forms of moral or ideological orthodoxy. So this new morality is based more critically on rhetoric around identity in particular, and also social justice. But I also think some of it is done out of sort of cynical self-interest, market self-interest. So many of the administrators just don't want the hassle of being caught in this moral crossfire, and so they easily acquiesce to this new morality, and many young people acquiesce, not necessarily because they authentically espouse this new morality, but largely because they think it's the sort of high status view to espouse, or the prestigious view to espouse, to get ahead in the new cultural industry and institutions. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer to your question.
I guess I would just follow up by briefly asking you, do you think that this kind of new morality is sufficient to like actually hold the diversity that they're asking for?
No, it's not, and I think it is. I think by its very nature, it's unsustainable. I think in part because many of the people that espouse it are unsustainable in many ways in terms of their own sense of themselves, but also in part because it's very much mediated through the digital landscape, and that's very much a landscape which is characterized by transience, by transient experiences. So I don't think it's, and I also think it's unsustainable because there's a sort of negative feedback loop which is involved. So many, so it's what's known as a sort of purity spiral. So the conditions for sort of ideological purity are so harsh that it's very difficult for any sort of functioning person to satisfy those particular conditions. So there will always be new targets, and ideally for somebody like me, it runs out of steam, because I don't think that sort of that purity spiral, negative feedback loop can sort of carry on for a long time, if that makes sense.
So we've got a few minutes left, and so I think we'll just have all the rest of the questions, and then we'll have Lionel and Tomiwa make their closing, just ending remarks, maybe summarize their points. So we'll just take the questions, but I don't think we'll have time to get through all of them, but just have an opportunity to hear them. So Luke, Alistair and Nancy, Luke, do you want to just say about something to the audience and to the panel?
Yeah, thanks, Inaya. Thanks for coming, Lionel and Tomiwa. It's been really interesting. My question was, I guess, going back right to the start. Lionel, you mentioned your definition of literary freedom, which is basically to read and write whatever you want. And Inaya used that example at the start as well as To Kill a Mockingbird sort of being banned by certain schools. And I did a little bit of reading into that and saw it seemed like it's been happening for decades, like To Kill a Mockingbird being limited by certain institutions and being dropped for various reasons. So I guess just to play devil's advocate here, like it doesn't seem to me like your ability to read or write whatever you want is affected by individual institutions dropping or picking up certain pieces of literature. So can you explain why you don't think schools have the right to do that as they see fit? And just taking note as well of what's been going on in the chat as well as in this conversation, are we not in danger of overstating the problem and using hyperbolic language like banned and burned, and choosing specific examples from individual institutions, rather than having a broad approach of seeing what the patterns are over a space of time? Are we 100% sure now that the problem is worse than it is before, beyond all this chat about decolonizing the curriculum and increasing diversity?
Okay. Alistair, and then Nancy, and then we'll just have closing remarks.
Okay.
From Tomiwa.
Thanks, Inaya, and thanks to both of you. It's been a very thought-provoking conversation. Quite a lot of it's been about the constraints, so I just wanted to flip it round a bit and to ask you both if there's any works that you've seen in the last year or so, couple of years, that have managed to transcend some of those constraints and actually offer some indication of a route out of it, because obviously for an audience it's incredibly frustrating, the narrowing of the terrain. So what, can you give us a couple of things to go off and search out at a bookshop that offer us some sort of way out of this?
And then Nancy.
Right. Lionel, you said that you thought that it couldn't go on forever, that you wanted to look back on this period. And I would like to look back on it too, but I don't see I don't see why it would change. And I also see that it's more difficult if we don't have access to things like To Kill a Mockingbird, to the fullest and best work that we have, that we have ever produced. So if you know something I don't, I would like to know it. Thanks.
Right. So just 1 minute, if you want to pick up on anything and round anything up. Lana, do you want to go first?
I'd say that, questioning how bad it is is profitable. I think this is real. Just a second, that's my phone. Sorry about that. I think this is real. It's worth touching base with the fact that there are books sometimes being canceled. There are people losing their jobs. But it probably does do us a disservice to be consumed by this, because that's a way of allowing the opposition to win. I think the most important thing to do to preserve freedom of speech, freedom in literature, is to exercise it. And that includes buying things, buying books, reading books, and even articles that question modern orthodoxy, as well as writing things that don't necessarily adhere to the rules as you perceive them at present. That's how you preserve freedom. The main thing that is making our era so fearful is adherence to rules that don't really exist. And we have to stop obeying them. There's a way in which we have to start laughing at them now, rather than, the more you adhere to them, the more people are going to invent more that you have to obey. There is a real crisis of freedom of speech. I have seen that most of all through COVID, and I think that's been useful because it's not about race and gender for once, or not for the most part. And yet we see big tech moving in and controlling what we can and cannot access, what we can know. And that's real censorship, and it is really frightening. And right now we've got a deadly alliance between big tech, big media, and government. And that is scary. And it's a lot bigger than literature and the tiny little publishing industry.
And final thoughts, Tomiwa?
In terms of work that might be worth reading, I'm a big fan of the French novelist Michel Houellebecq. I think I would start with his first novel, which is translated into English as Whatever, published in the mid-90s, and then read the rest of his work. I'm a big fan because I think He challenges a lot of the ideological orthodoxies of our time, but I think he does it in a way that's also artistically rich and also ambivalent as well. In terms of my final thoughts in general, I would say I think just looking at the issue in terms of just exclusively in terms of free speech is insufficient. I think we also need to look at it in terms of more general notions such as tolerance and pluralism. And I think paradoxically, I think the sort of attitude that's needed to encourage and cultivate those general views are attitudes that would be considered slightly conservative and puritanical. So it requires on the part of many people a degree of self-discipline and a degree of humility. So like classical virtues, which I think are absolutely essential in order to encourage this sort of atmosphere in which freedom of expression can thrive.
Thank you so much. It's been an incredibly stimulating, thought-provoking and broad discussion. So I just want to say a huge thank you to our fantastic panelists. Amazing. I also want to say thank you to Rob, one of our free speech champions who thought through and conceptualized this event, and all of the champions and everyone for attending. And just before we go, the Battle of Ideas Festival is hosting an event this Saturday called Open for Debate. And it's one of the elements of the event is sponsored by the Free Speech Champions Project. So please consider coming along this Saturday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. in Church House in Westminster. And many of these things that we're talking about, we will continue to be discussing them. And it's a great opportunity to meet a lot of the other young people that are involved in this project and are exploring and examining many of these very interesting and important questions of our time. So thank you so much. And thank you again to the panelists. Really, really, really amazing discussion. And the event has come to an end. So enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody.